So the first couple of lectures are really just setting the kind of framework for social neuroscience, really talking about the methods, some of the key concepts around culture, genes, the brain, and so on. The next three lectures I kind of think of as being the building blocks of social neuroscience, if you will. So this week it's about emotion, next week about faces and bodies, and the week after is about, mirroring and mentalizing. So empathy, theory of mind, and so on. And then beyond that, what we go on to talk about are very specific topics, such as antisocial behaviour, morality, social decision-making, relationships, and so on. But a lot of them feed from these core concepts of emotion, empathy, reading each other's signals, and so on. So what is an emotion? Basically, we could think of them as a state. So it's something that is kind of transient, that is related to rewards and punishment. So rewards, things that you want to get, and punishment, things you want to avoid. That's the kind of behavioural definition of them. And basically, often emotions are centred around stimuli that have inherent survival value, but also our brain mechanisms have learned to be very flexible. We can learn to like very bizarre things, and we can learn to dislike some things that appear to be inherently good for our survival as well. And one of the other key distinctions is between emotion and motivation. So basically, motivation is it's something to do with motivation. But so an example here would be liking and wanting. So where liking is an emotion and wanting would be the motivation. Okay, so it's something that kind of triggers action, either avoidance or seeking. Approach and avoidance, in effect. That's the key concepts behind motivation. Whereas emotion's more about kind of value, liking, disliking, and so on. Yeah, so an example here would be enjoying chocolate, which would be emotional, and wanting chocolate, which would be motivational. And of course, you can apply the same thing to not just the chocolate, but to kind of, social objects as well. So being in the company of a loved one would be an emotional state, but wanting the company of a loved one would be a motivational state. Okay. So one of the key messages from this lecture, although I talk about emotions from social and non-social evidence, is that basically it's pretty much the same brain mechanisms to some degree involved in these very different kind of things. Chocolate in one case and love in the other. And there are differences, but there is a strong overlap as well. So one of the things about emotions that kind of, I guess, has led to something of a historical bad reputation is the idea that they can mean different things. And that in itself isn't a problem. Or we just have to recognise that emotions have different meanings, and we have to be clear what meaning we're talking about. And that in itself isn't a problem. So if you take something like vision, that kind of has lots of different kind of processes. You've got conscious and unconscious vision. You've got all kinds of mechanisms and different features that contribute to that. So emotions obviously have a subjective quality, and this is often called the kind of hedonic value themselves, the kind of the subjective liking, disliking. Also, and here this is pretty much measured through questionnaires. So again, how you measure emotion depends on what aspect of emotion you're measuring. They've also got a particular feeling state. So for instance, emotions have an internal body reaction, sweating, heart rate, and so on, may be promoted by the survival value. So again, you would want to measure that differently. So here you would measure it kind of psychophysiology. And then, of course, the question is, do these two aspects relate to each other? They probably should, but at the same time, it would be unfair to expect them to be identical because they're probably relying on somewhat different mechanisms in the brain as well. They also have particular external outcomes. So here you've got internal bodily responses that you can't observe by other people, except obviously by putting things on their skin and recording. But here you've got expressions, so bodily expressions and facial expressions, and these are obviously very important kind of communicative signals that enable us to try and figure out what somebody else is thinking internally. And then you've got various kinds of, I guess, more kind of cognitive or schematic responses, so fight and flight, and also orienting responses that you pay attention to things that are emotional, both positive and negative. Also, I think one of the kind of arguments is that emotions they do have a function, and historically, the Victorians would often think that emotions were dysfunctional, that in order to survive you have to think reasonably and put aside your kind of affective judgment, and you might still see this maybe in some kind of leadership programs, for business executives and so on, but that's not how decision-making works in everyday situations, that basically a lot of our decisions are guided by emotion, and this probably it is meaningful, and it does have some survival value. Whether or not that goes into competition with other things, such as economic decisions and so on, is an interesting one, and we will cover that in other lectures. But basically, you could kind of imagine, the classic kind of sci-fi description of robots and so on who lack emotions. And I guess the kind of philosophical spin on this is surely you can build people who are just like us, who function just like us, who don't have an emotion. Okay? And really, this is kind of the sort of living proof of that, is, well, you can do. But actually, they don't function like us necessarily. Or it kind of depends on what you think an emotion is. So if an emotion is something that, for instance, elicits more attention to certain stimuli which are going to harm you or going to be good for you, if it enables you to remember some stimuli better, enables you to prepare to react quickly, then why shouldn't this guy have an emotion? Okay? So here we're kind of thinking about emotions more in terms of subjective feelings, and that's not right. So, in terms of an emotion eliciting these kinds of responses, it would be adaptive for any system to have it. Whether or not they actually feel it themselves or could have some kind of metacognition about it is a somewhat different question, but they are still useful, at least in some of these kinds of tick boxes. And also, there's a strong social side to the emotions, and the reason for this is that basically we're kind of living in a group is something that is adaptive, that has survival value for us. We can watch each other's backs, we can hunt together, we can share rewards. So when I've got something and you're kind of poor, you can share, and the idea is that they will reciprocate, and that is in both of your interests and so on. So the idea is that in social species, these basic mechanisms are then adapted to things such as empathy, altruism, fear of rejection, moral disgust. So one claim is that I kind of disgust about somebody else's inappropriate behaviours using the same kinds of neural mechanisms that other species would use when they encounter some contaminant, such as poo or something like this. That's one claim. There's some evidence for it. So often, emotions are seen as being acting kind of a social glue. It kind of enables us to kind of interact, to not just act selflessly and so on. So in this sense, they're not necessarily irrational. It's about the long-term game, and the long-term game is living together and reproducing more effectively because of the advantages of group survival. The other social side of emotions is around communication as well. So social species communicate emotions to each other either deliberately or unintentionally via their faces, their voices, and various other cues. And again, we're very adept at picking up on those and trying to understand them. So, for instance, again, okay, so this would be a good example of this kind of very basic conditioning response applying in a social setting. So this is your classical kind of Pavlovian response where you've got some intrinsic reward here, such as food that an animal likes, being paired with something that's neutral, that it neither likes or dislikes, that here triggers some kind of behavior, in this case salivating. So you pair them together. If you have the bell by itself, obviously it doesn't trigger this kind of what you might want to call an emotional reaction. But over time, of course, the bell itself will trigger that in itself. So it's almost as if the bell psychologically induces an emotional state that's related to the food, this kind of wanting or expectation. The equivalent kind of situation in the social domain would be some kind of social referencing that can be demonstrated with a neutral child's toy. So in this case here, you've got an object which the child would be unfamiliar with and be neutral about, at least in an ideal situation. If the parent kind of smiles as the infant goes near it, the child will play with this. Whereas if the infant kind of frowns or looks worried, the child will avoid that. So here the child is kind of learning about objects in the social world learning about objects in the physical world via social interactions with others. But again, the idea about this is that you don't then have to learn what's good or bad by trial and error. You can learn what's good or bad via other people. And again, this should have some kind of group advantage in the sense that you don't have to learn that snakes are bad by self-discovery. You can learn it by looking at another animal's reaction to it. Okay. And there are various lines of evidence that, again, we will encounter time and again with this. So when we come to our lecture that covers neuroeconomics, this is the kind of evidence we'll look at here. But here you've got an interactive game in which you're trying to win money cooperatively. So you make a decision and something else makes a decision. In one case, that's something else. You tell the participant is another human in the other room. And in another condition, you tell the participant the computer is making a decision according to some algorithm. And what you find is that if you win £1 through cooperating with another human, your reward circuitry gets activated a lot more than if you win £1 by interacting with a computer. Even though in both cases you are interacting with a computer, but in one case you have a belief that you're interacting with a human. And there's something about that belief that is in itself a reward. So again, there's something inherently rewarding about cooperating and interacting over and above the actual kind of physical or more objective rewards that one might have. Yeah?
Is that the same true for competition?
For competition, that's a really interesting one. Yes, so you've got various kinds of modulators of this. So, for instance, if you take something like testosterone, which is kind of the uber thing, that would bias against that. So you would find it somewhat less rewarding with a human. If you go to somebody oxytocin, which is kind of a love hormone, then you have a much greater effect. So it's basically true, but you've got ups and downs in the story. Yeah, it's a really good question, yeah. And obviously interacting with your own personality and various other traits as well that would come into that. But it's broadly true. Yeah, so again, one conclusion of this is that we're not just interacting with each other for material rewards. Somehow the interactions with other people have some reward value in themselves. So that's... so that's kind of just a bit of a preamble here, and really we've got three different parts of this. So one is I'll talk about historical perspectives on emotion, or kind of theoretical ideas around the emotion, some which have some common currency and some that don't. I'll talk about how many emotions are there, or how do we divide or categorize emotions? Are there a fixed number, or do we have to think about a kind of a space of emotions? And if there is a space of emotions, what are the kind of axes that go through it, for instance? Then I'll talk a little bit about motivation, rewards, and punishment. And a lot of what I'll go through in this lecture is actually talking about some of the key neural mechanisms, so regions like the amygdala, the insula, orbitofrontal cortex, and so on. So this might feel slightly jargony to you, but what I would say is that if it does feel jargony to you, that's a trigger that you need to go and kind of replay this lecture a little bit, because I am going to use these words and phrases quite a bit in the coming lectures. So this will be building on others. So if you're struggling with all these brain areas, I suggest that you kind of go and do some reading, but I will try and guide you through it. So Darwin wrote a whole kind of book on emotions in the 1870s. So this was something that he was very interested in from an evolutionary point of view. And he was very interested in this here, in the kind of outward expressions of emotions. So here, the kind of thing that he was intrigued by was the fact that, so here you've got kind of anger or fierceness in all these cases, but you've got the same kinds of reaction in these different species, including these very different species here, such as dogs, although dogs are obviously being cultured to some extent, but I think that that's not part of it. And he had lots of other evidence about infants, about people who are blind, and so on. So he was very much interested in the idea that these are somehow very instinctive and innate, but also something that are conserved and therefore must be important from a survival point of view. And he was also very interested in the idea that these are communicative socially. So they reveal the thoughts and intentions of others more clearly than words do. So again, we see kind of Darwin's approach very much in some contemporary approaches. So when I talk about Ekman's ideas of basic emotions, he's effectively saying that there are a finite number of emotions, but he's basing his theory on kind of outward expressions in the face is his primary evidence for this. So Darwin obviously had something interesting to say about this. Obviously, he's not recognising the whole panoply of what we would think of as emotions, so the internal bodily states, conscious and unconscious processing of emotions. Freud also, had something very interesting to say about them, and his kind of big claim was obviously to do with the idea of conscious versus unconscious emotions, but also this link between emotion and motivation, that basically emotions are what guides our behaviour. The other thing that Freud kind of got right is basically the link between emotion and mental health, which most people would kind of regard as being true. Obviously, this was framed very much in kind of 19th century terms about hysterical women and all the rest that don't really have kind of, the same kind of currency today. And similarly, lots of his other ideas about, infants and their parents as sexual objects and so on, again, don't have any currency in basic science. But there are some kind of core elements of his idea about emotions that were influential and that you could see as kind of being there in contemporary theories as well. So James and Lange is again another kind of late 19th century view that kind of died a bit of a death but has been resurrected and has some currency in some forms in contemporary neuroscience. So the interesting thing here is that basically what the claim is that when you see an emotional stimulus, that it triggers some reaction in your body. So here, this would be particularly your internal body, or maybe some expression, or maybe an action response, so you're going to run away. And then your brain, in effect, interprets that response as an emotional state. So the James-Lange theory effectively puts the body and these kind of very basic autonomic responses to do with sweating, muscle tension, and so on, as the core of the emotions, and kind of cognition and so on as being more the interpretation of those emotions with that. So that's this kind of route here. The study which for many people kind of put the death to this theory is the Schachter and Singer study from the 1960s, which is one of these classic studies that most of you probably heard about. But what they had here is that they administered a drug that we call adrenaline. In the States, it's epinephrine, isn't it? Is that right? So adrenaline and epinephrine. But either way, what this does is that it has a strong effect on the autonomic system. It makes your heart race and other kinds of effects such as that. And what they wanted to know is, does that affect somebody's emotional reactions? And here they had emotional reactions primarily by questionnaire, although I think they might have observed the behaviour of the people as well. So you either had epinephrine or adrenaline or a placebo. And the other thing that they also had, which was groundbreaking, is that they also had a social context. And the social context here was somebody who, whilst they're in the doctor's waiting room after their injection, somebody who's incredibly annoying and irritating, or somebody who's Mr. kind of funny and happy or whatever. I would probably find quite irritating, but the idea was it should have been a positive experience for them. And the question was, how do these two things interact, the bodily reaction and the social setting? And what they found is that basically the social setting is the key determinant of the participants' at least subjective emotion. But that doesn't mean that there was no role of the drug itself. So what the effect the drug had was those who had the adrenaline felt the emotion more, in effect. So it exacerbated it. But the drug by itself was not sufficient to trigger the emotion. Okay? So that was the key evidence against the James-Lange theory that came from the 1960s. Since then, others have kind of re-evaluated that. So Damasio would be one of the people, but also here at Sussex we've got somebody called Hugo Critchley who's very interested in interoception, so your body's internal state. And he's also interested in the idea of this being a core aspect of the emotion. So how does this square with this historical evidence? Well, in the Shachter and Singer study, here they're measuring drugs and social settings, but their measure of emotion is essentially a subjective one on a questionnaire. Now, it might be that people actually make decisional judgments based on their bodily state that isn't reflected in the questionnaire. So maybe after adrenaline, people do behave in particular ways that on more subtle measures that don't do that. So there is evidence for that. So Damasio's theory, he's very interested in the idea that these emotional responses can be unconscious, so they're not going to manifest themselves in a questionnaire measures about how happy you are, but nevertheless they guide your behaviour in, say, risky decision making. So that's his kind of paradigm there, is that you kind of use these bodily responses to say, I'm not going to pick up this card because it's got a high risk of a fine, and so on, even though the person can't tell you that that's a bad deck. That's his kind of claim. So the idea is that the bodily responses might be important, but it might be influencing other aspects of emotion rather than what you might get on a questionnaire, for instance. That's how it's kind of made a comeback, is this idea of the multifaceted emotion that hasn't always been there. The Cannon-Bard theory is kind of the other way around, which we would kind of regard as more true, that basically your brain's perception of a situation, whether it be social or non-social, is exacerbating or affecting the emotional expression itself. Again, you might have multiple routes going through that brain, conscious and unconscious. The specific ideas behind Cannon-Bard that they articulated are not what we would hold to today. So Cannon-Bard differs from James-Lange, Freud and Darwin in that this was an explicitly neurobiological theory. They located or tried to locate emotions in one particular part of the brain, and they put it in the hypothalamus. One of the reasons why they did this is, again, around this idea of emotional expressions. So again, in the 1870s, when Darwin was publishing his thing, there was a group of researchers called Fritsch and Herzig, or something like this, who were studying the motor cortex of animals and found that when you lesion the motor cortex, the animals couldn't produce voluntary movements, but they could produce emotional expressions like rage and so on. So this was also one of the classic ideas that emotions is not something that happens in the cortex, it happens deeper down. Which is also true, but it's also misleading to say the cortex doesn't have a role, and this is one of the problems with this. So that was one of their evidence. So they kind of, it was based around lesion studies. The hypothalamus is important for some aspects of emotions, but it certainly isn't the core aspect of it necessarily. There are plenty of other regions that are involved with this. But again, the kind of the model that came off the back of Cannon-Bard was also centered very much about the idea that it is the subcortex which is the origin of emotions. But again, a lot of this is coming from emotions in the sense of observable behavior, because they're using animal models. They can't get the animal to do a questionnaire or other kinds of things. All they can do is look at its motor responses with that. And again, so the Papez and Maclean kind of had the idea of the limbic brain, or what's called the Papez circuit, which are these regions here. So the hippocampus, the cingulate, the hypothalamus, so this key region there. That in effect, you've got this largely undifferentiated circuit. So they made no claims that one region is more involved in fear and the one in disgust and so on. It was essentially a circuit that globally supported emotions. how does this theory square now? Well, certainly some of these regions are critical for emotions, but some of them aren't. So, for instance, the hippocampus, people often thought that this was really an essential area for emotion. It was only until 20, 30 years after this idea in the 1950s with the amnesic patient HM that actually people thought, oh, this is probably more involved in memory than it is in emotion. Okay, so some parts of the limbic system aren't, you certainly wouldn't want to label their primary function as being emotion. So this notion of limbic equals emotion isn't quite right. Similarly, it's not quite right that all emotions are kind of buried down there in the subcortex. The cortex itself is very important for emotion. Whether it's just as important for all aspects of emotion isn't clear, but certainly the actual kind of feeling states, the reportability of emotions, it is important from that. But maybe some things like a facial rage reaction and so on, you might be able to get via other means or other effects, or certainly some bodily states might be driven by more subcortical mechanisms. So again, it depends, are the emotions in the limbic system? It's like, what aspect of emotions are you talking about? Because some might be, some might not be. And the other thing that's kind of happened, but this has yo-yoed around a little bit, is the idea as to whether or not you've got separate circuits, so one for different emotions, so a separate circuit for fear, a separate circuit for disgust, and so on. So this, we explicitly denied that idea, and then that became the most popular idea, and now we've got a few deniers of that idea as well. So these ideas do shift around, but it's not quite going back in time. They take on new guises over time. Any kind of questions about that overview? I will kind of go over this. Okay. So are there different emotions in the brain? So this is Paul Ekman, who basically came up with the idea that there are 6 basic emotions. So what do we mean by basic, and what's the evidence for them? I'll let him kind of describe this to you in his own words.
Well, it was a big discovery because before then, people were influenced by Margaret Mead, who claimed emotions were a total cultural product. That there were societies in which people never had emotions because they didn't have the idea of explaining their behavior that way. Mead also claimed that the look of anger in one culture was the look of enjoyment in another, and that you needed, in that sense, a Berlitz's book to understand emotion. Darwin, in 1872, based on his experience in the voyages of the Eagle 50 years earlier, made just the opposite claim, that emotions are universal to the species. They are what unite all of humanity. He said we all have these emotions, and even though we can't understand what we say in other language, we can understand what people are feeling. It's an enormously useful thing. How did I do the science? Well, I did a lot of different studies, but the one that was key was going into a Stone Age pre-literate culture where they were actually using stone implements in the highlands of New Guinea. This was in 1967 and again in 1968. These people had never seen photographs, films. Most of them had never seen another outsider. They had never seen their own face because there was no still water and there certainly were no mirrors. I decided the only way to settle this dispute between Darwin and Mead, and Mead was winning at this point. And I didn't really care who was right. I just wanted to see if we could find out what is it.
It goes on a bit.
Yeah. Are they universal or are they a cultural invention, like gestures are? There's no gesture, not even a head say yes and no, which is universal. And Darwin was right on that also. He said they were a cultural invention, and indeed they are. So this REOK is a terrible insult in Sicily. I won't tell you what the insult is, but come through it if you ever live in Sicily. So I needed to find people who couldn't have been influenced by the outside world, who wouldn't have learned their expressions from John Wayne, or I should use a more contemporary act than John Wayne, Michelle Pfeiffer, or any other. They would have learned it as a part of the revolution. That meant they had to be totally visually isolated. And in 67 and 68, I was able to find such a group. I knew they were disappearing, and by 70 they were gone. These people had seen movies by 1970. So one of the things I did was through another, I learned Pidgin, and I found one boy who had gone to a missionary school, and he learned Pidgin, so he became my translator, 12-year-old boy. So I would tell them a story, like, friends have come that you really like and you haven't seen in a long time. Show me the expression on your face, and I would film it. Your child is coming. Show me the expression on your face. Of course, they weren't camera shy, because they knew what a camera was. You're about to fight. Show me the expression on your face. You'll see the perfect. They're the same as you'd see anywhere else in the world. So that was really the strong evidence.
Okay. Any kind of comments? Okay. So basically what he did is he had two lines of evidence. One is the kind of going into what he called the Stone Age culture in Papua New Guinea and presenting them with the vignettes and getting them to produce facial expressions. And then he also had a cross-cultural element where he would take the facial expressions from Papua New Guinea to California and face from California to Papua New Guinea and get them to kind of say what that person is thinking or feeling. And he started with a much larger set. So there are some things like love and so on, which you don't get very clearly from a face. So it wasn't that he started with a fixed number, is that he started with a large set and tried to figure out what is common across cultures. Yeah.
Before face recognition technology, how did he actually determine whether these were in fact the same?
Just subjective judgment, yeah. So it was just cross-rater judgments, yeah. So there's other people doing the same with vocal expressions. So Sophie Scott at UCL's kind of asked the question: how many types of laughter are there? So there's kind of embarrassed laughter, genuine laugh, and to what extent are these kind of universal across cultures? I think she's got a similar number as well, but this is obviously a bit more technologically advanced. So let's go through them. So what's this one here? Sad, happy, disgust, yeah. What's this one? Surprise, anger, and fear. So he bases evidence primarily on facial expressions, that they're culturally invariant. He's also, in his original theory, but also subsequently kind of added a number of other criteria. So having its own specific neural basis. In a way, I guess his logic is that in order for these to kind of be conserved and innate and distinguished from each other, that must be true. Actually, the evidence for it is not clear-cut at all. That each emotion has evolved to deal with different kind of survival mechanisms. So the reason why you've got fear is quite different from the reason why you've got disgust. They've been shaped by different pressures over time that have shaped different circuits to meet different kinds of demands. And that's why you wouldn't necessarily have an emotional soup that kind of kicks out all of these different things. And also that they occur automatically. So that's his claim. He was also, how many people have seen this film? Oh, come on. It's embarrassed to admit it. Okay, so Paul Ekman was again one of the consultants on Inside Out, where you've got these 5 emotions in human brains that are kind of talking to each other and kind of trying to control their conscious thoughts and so on. I did kind of Google yesterday why surprise wasn't there, and they felt that 5 was a better number. So it's that's basically. But again, people do debate what the correct number is, and so on. But what about other things? Surely we kind of have a sense of an emotional life that is richer than the number 6 or 5 if you're watching a Disney film. And certainly not everybody is kind of happy with basic emotion approach, either that they think it's wrong or that there clearly is something beyond that. So various possibilities have kind of been put forward. So the idea of kind of emotional blends, so the guilt, for instance, as being joy and fear. I don't know, so you get all these kind of wheels of emotions where you can blend two together to create new ones that are kind of hybrids of them. Another popular idea that we'll kind of encounter, particularly in what we can call moral emotions, is the idea that you've got a mixture of a basic emotion plus some kind of cognitive appraisal, where the cognitive appraisal might be an appraisal of somebody's social intentions or the context in which this emotion is occurring. So moral in the sense of you might have a basic sense of disgust, but at the same time it's grafted on within a social context of norm violation and so on. So moral disgust wouldn't be quite the same as kind of a basic sense of disgust in the sense of this person here, because it's kind of situated within this sort of appraisal mechanism. And this is just a completely different approach. It's not grounded in neuroscience, but actually the idea of appraisal is there. So here you've got what's called, you don't really have to read in detail, a valence reaction to, so a consequences of events for the self. So here you've got something like disappointment, which is a consequence for yourself, in which the prospects are relevant for yourself but disconfirmed. So something hasn't happened to you and so on. So whether or not obviously you haven't deliberately gone through this thought process, but the idea is that you've got emotions are effectively being triggered by a complex set of appraisals. So whether or not that's kind of incompatible with the basic idea of a finite set of emotions or grafted onto it isn't clear with this. But you can kind of imagine how this could be cross-culturally applicable in the sense that, a sense of disappointment would come through the same sense of decision makings and appraisals through different brains. But it's not making an obvious distinction between basic and other emotions. So this is another kind of counterclaim that has kind of become more popular within neuroscience, primarily by Lisa Feldman Barrett. And her favourite film is not Inside Out. She's written blogs about how much she dislikes it if you want to go and read them. Because for her, the idea of basic emotions is a myth scientifically that should not be kind of propagated in popular culture. What you kind of have is the notion of kind of core affect that is where, in effect, emotions are kind of endpoints of various continua in I guess, a kind of emotional space. Some of the original kind of evidence for this was kind of taking people's current mood rating. So you effectively ask people, again on questionnaires, to rate their moods, and then you could do some fancy quantitative stats on that to see what the underlying dimensions are that predicts everyone's current mood state. And basically you can have moods that go along one axis of activation, deactivation. So deactivation would be feelings of calm or alert, for instance. And then here, another axis of how pleasant or unpleasant it is. So happiness would score highly on the pleasant dimension and moderately on the activation dimension. Fear would be both unpleasant and strongly activating. Disgust would be unpleasant there. So where do the categories come from then? She would say the categories are effectively linguistic or socially labelled. So she's not really engaging with Ekman's kind of evidence here that there might be some categorical kind of motor-based reactions for this. It's based on other kinds of evidence for this. Yeah.
When this person is saying about activation and deactivation, what exactly does that refer to?
That's a really good question. So basically, what they have is, she calls it a system of core affect. And basically, a lot of that is centered around the amygdala, but she includes a lot of different regions which are contributing to this signal. So it is kind of very much like some of the historical ideas about the limbic system as kind of a more undifferentiated, this is something that you need to attend to, So this is primarily what she's claiming,
yeah.
and others.
As I understood it, but maybe I'm wrong, depression, which here is characterised as an inactivation,
Yes.
is characterised by an overfiring of some. So that's why I was asking.
Oh, I see. Yeah, I mean, yes, I'm not sure. I mean, yeah. So you're probably right. I mean, one of the symptoms of depression is often called a kind of hypofrontality. So there's regions of the frontal lobes that we'll talk about later to do with reward and so on. They are reduced. But what you can have in depression is things like an over-attention to people's what people are thinking about you, and that kind of anxious thoughts. So you've kind of got cognitive biases that are very, centered on certain things that would be overactive. But yes, yeah.
I guess what I was just trying to get at is that it's kind of saying what that activation and deactivation action specifically refers to.
Yeah, I would. Yeah, I don't think that she's actually labelled these two as separate things, but she has this system that's called core affect that would effectively kind of be this whole thing that is based a lot on the amygdala, but also on a lot of other regions as well that work as a network. So it's a more kind of diffuse, kind of more nebulous idea behind this. So what is the kind of evidence for this? So how can we kind of contrast some of these theories? Well, we can take certain regions and kind of ask what do they do, and are they kind of specialized for one emotion or not? So the two I will look at, because there's the kind of the best evidence for them, is what does the amygdala do? And in particular, is it particularly specialized for fear, or does it have a much broader role? And what about the insula, so these, which is involved in disgust? So are there separate regions or networks centered around these? And if there are, that would be more compatible with the Ekman approach. If they're involved in every emotion, then maybe it's more compatible with the Feldman-Barrett approach. So the amygdala is involved in social behavior. So this is evidence from monkeys in which you've got a monkey troop here where you've got Dave, Zeki and Reva. So Dave is dominant, self-assured and fearful. Zeki is aggressive and attacker. Reva's aggressive and active. And this is their dominance hierarchy here. These three animals have amygdalectomies, and again, you have a disruption in their social behavior. So Dave, who was at the top, is an outcast who flees from all after his amygdalectomy. Zeki also goes to the bottom of the pile. Reva goes up. In humans, you also can show that some people become more fearful, some become more aggressive. It's seen as being involved in fight and flight. But anyway, it's the most common reaction is kind of an unusual tameness is seen, or kind of eating food which they wouldn't normally have, so it's almost as if they've lost the emotional value of particular things, or that they're not necessarily afraid. That's one symptom. More kind of precise research has been done by Ledoux, who's really kind of been arguing for a strong connection between the amygdala and fear, although to be fair, he hasn't said that the amygdala isn't involved in other emotions. He's just presented positive evidence that the amygdala is crucial for fear, without the contrary evidence that it's not involved for other things. And again, this is the kind of classic evidence that the amygdala is involved in fear. So this is kind of your Pavlovian conditioning here. So here you've got bars on the cage that you can pass a mild electric shock through, and at the same time you've got a tone. So initially the tone is neutral. It doesn't elicit a response. When it's electrified, the cage, at the same time as the sound, the animal has a freezing response. But then when you play the sound here, without the shock, the animal has a freezing response there. If you were to lesion the amygdala or certain nuclei within the amygdala, you will abolish both the learning response. If the animal learns this response and then has its amygdalectomy, it will forget the response. So it's involved in both the learning and the remembering of conditioned responses. Interestingly, the animal will still show a shock response to a fearful stimulus. So it will still go like that when it gets a shock. So the actual bodily response to it is still there. So it can still show a fear reaction, but it's unable to learn about the fearful properties of a stimuli, or it forgets them. And the idea there is that you've got some stimuli, such as a shock, which have an innate fear response, and others in which the fear response is learnt, and it's specifically about the learning here. The interesting thing in humans is that if you do fMRI, you can compare different sounds. You can have one sound that used to be predictive of a shock and one that isn't. So you can actually do this paired associate learning outside the scanner, and then you put people in the scanner, you just play them two different tones, one of which has been paired with the shark and one that hasn't. That's the tone that's been paired with the shark will activate the amygdala, and a skin conductance response or a sweating response, and the two are correlated. What's also interesting is that you can get the same thing from watching somebody else get the shock. So you haven't got to do it yourself. You're just watching somebody else listen to a tone, then they'll get a shock and the hand will go like this. It's actually an actor that's kind of doing it. But that's enough when you listen to the tones for you to do that. So again, it's this kind of vicarious learning. You haven't got to go through everything yourself through self-discovery. We can learn about what's out there via others. This is also interesting, that patients with lesions of the amygdala fail to show the skin conductance response, but they can verbally report the association. So again, here, it's almost as if the memory for the emotion is stored in different regions. One is kind of a verbal association, so they can say, oh yeah, whenever I hear that sound, I get a shock, whereas whenever I hear that sound, I don't get a shock, or often it's paired with colours rather than lights. But so they can say that this is what the contingency is, but their bodily reaction does not produce a fear response. Okay. Interestingly, amnesics show the opposite profile. So they'll say, I have no idea what these tones mean or what they predict, but when they hear one tone, they start sweating. So they've learnt that through a different route. So the amygdala storing the actual fear association, the hippocampus seems to be storing something about the event or the kind of narrative, the context around this, if you will. If you damage the amygdala, it does affect your ability to recognize the Ekman emotions, and fear is disproportionately affected. So this has led some people to argue that the amygdala is particularly involved in fear. Similarly, in fMRI, if you compare fear with happy, this has also been shown to activate the amygdala more. Now, the kind of contrary evidence that people have used to say, oh, hang on a minute, that might not prove specialization, is the idea that fear might be a particularly potent emotion. So it might be that when you see fear and happy, that actually fear is just something that is a lot more orienting or alerting as a response than happy, so that they are not matched in any sense of the word. That's one kind of claim that's been made here. And that would also explain that. But you can also have the contrary dissociation here with the insula. The other thing that Ledoux's been involved with, which there's some evidence for, is that this conditioning can kind of happen unconsciously, or that you can activate the amygdala from seeing a stimulus without being consciously aware of getting an emotional response. You've got this fast reaction. So he's argued that you've got links between the auditory and visual cortex to the amygdala that are fast, that don't go through this elaborate oh, what is it there? Is it a snake or whatever? That you've got something that triggers an emotional response, then you alert to it, and then you realise, oh, it's a snake. Okay. And there's some evidence that fear is involved in that. So is it only involved in fear? Well, it doesn't seem to be, but again, one of the problems with the human-based neuroscience is that you're dealing here with the amygdala as one entity. There are, in fact, multiple circuits going through it and multiple nuclei. So there are some nuclei that seem to be more involved in fear and some that seem to be involved in other things. So there are studies looking at appetitive conditioning, so involve food and so on, where it seems to involve somewhat different circuits. So it does have a role in other aspects, but this might not always be present in the human neuropsychology literature or the human fMRI literature, because we haven't got the resolution to look at the different circuits within them. That's one possibility. But it's certainly not the case that it is just for fear, but there might be some relatively specialized circuits within that. Why, for instance, is it then, if that's the case, that other facial expressions are damaged? And this is less clear why that is. to damage the amygdala. It might be that here that the amygdala is kind of core for fear, but it's involved in other emotions, but actually the other emotions are more distributed. That would be one possibility. Also, people have kind of said, well, you can't, that fear and happiness aren't well matched, but you can actually match other kinds of things. So here, this is for percentage signal change for odours. So you can have odours that are supposedly equally intense according to subjective ratings, and this is the amygdala response. You can show that the amygdala responds to pleasant odours as well as unpleasant ones. And this has been done with other things such as pictures, tastes, and so on. So in general, what you do find is that the amygdala has a response to pleasant relative to neutral. One of the other things that is also relatively consistent in this literature is that it has a bigger response to unpleasant relative to pleasant. So again, some of this disagreement comes about from what it is that you're feeding in as your baseline measure here. So it does seem to have a preference for unpleasant, but it also, if you put pleasant in relative to neutral, you can show that it is responding to that. There are interesting individual differences as well. So I said that happy faces don't tend to activate the amygdala in the same way. In some people they do. So people with extrovert personalities activate their amygdala a lot when they see a happy face. We don't know quite why that is. One idea is that for these people it's kind of more intense, that it's kind of, that if you go for the Bell-Feldman-Barrett kind of theory, that basically for them a happy face is kind of has a different status than it does for other people in terms of its emotional arousing, or its kind of positivity. So there's convincing evidence for the role of the amygdala in fear, but also a clear role for the amygdala in other aspects of emotion. So where does that leave us? Well, there could be different circuits going through the amygdala with different functions. So it might be that it's crucial for some aspects of fear, but it's also important for others. It could be also that there are various other kinds of confound that make fear seem to be important, but actually it's not really. It's just kind of a more extreme or a more a different kind of emotion for other ways, rather than it being a kind of a discrete category. What I'm going to do is suggest we have a break now for 10 minutes. I'll put this up if anybody's got a question. Carry on. So having considered the amygdala, I'll turn now to the insula. One claim that this has been particularly involved in the emotion of disgust. So, this is the amygdala here, which is kind of in the temporal lobes here, buried within it. The insula in Latin means island, and that's kind of beneath the frontal and temporal lobes, a kind of curve of cortex that sits there on either side, obviously. So some of the evidence here is that facial expressions of disgust seem to be more impaired when you damage the insula. One of the interesting things about the insula is that it also contains the cortex for the gustatory area of the brain involved in taste perception. So obviously the word disgust means bad taste, and the idea is that this kind of emotion is particularly parasitic around taste, parasitic on neural mechanisms involved in taste and smell. So disgust itself is kind of seen as being an evolved emotion around contamination, in effect, or avoidance of contamination. That would be the evolutionary rationale behind it. So it's perhaps not surprising that it might then become part of this region. Similarly, if you compare facial expressions of disgust, typically against happy, you will show that this region is involved. And another suggestion is that the moral disgust, so, if somebody's behaved particularly badly, David Cameron at university or something like this, you would also show a similar kind of reaction in your brain and in your facial expressions as well to that idea. But the insula is involved in various things. So it's involved generally in bodily perception and bodily feeling. So it's involved in taste perception, also in pain perception as well. And this also becomes important when we look at some other lectures involved in empathy. So seeing another person in pain will activate your insula, for instance, and what that might mean. The insula is also involved in other kinds of bodily feelings, which might be important markers for this. So heart rate, sweating, and so on. So Hugo Critchley, who I mentioned, who's based at Sussex in the medical school, is very interested in how the body and the brain interact, and particularly how things such as your heartbeat affects your influence, your feelings of fear or other emotion markers. And the insula seems to be one of these regions that is involved in registering these bodily responses. So this suggests that it might not be specific to disgust, but disgust itself might be perhaps a more embodied emotion, or at least may tap some of these other kinds of mechanisms that the insula is kind of involved with. So where does this leave the idea of basic emotions? I think we can say that there are different neural circuits with relative degrees of specialization for different emotions. Those circuits might be at the level of kind of whole anatomical structures like the amygdala, or it might be at other levels such as a particular nuclei within them. But nevertheless, there is some idea of relative specialization. Certainly when it comes to the other categories that Ekman's proposed, the evidence is very less clear-cut in terms of finding distinct neural substrates or markers for them. So certainly you would struggle to tell a whole story around each of these 6 emotions that have been hypothesized. Even if the evidence is true that they have different motor reactions, it's not clear that they all have very different or specialized mechanisms. Some seem to be very widely distributed. One of the other problems is what kind of makes something basic as well. So, for instance, when we come to talk about love, some people have argued that that's kind of a basic emotion in some sense, but not in others. So in the Ekman sense, if it doesn't have an obvious facial expression, it's not basic. But actually it seems to exist for some purpose, to bring people together and make them stay together, either in romantic relationships or to raise their children. That seems to be the basic function of this, and it does have kind of core neurobiological mechanisms that seem to be involved in that. So again, there are these blurred boundaries. Some emotions might be basic in some respects and not others. And again, there are other views. So the Feldman-Barrett view of emotions has been this kind of space of activity and arousal, or pleasantness and activity, sorry. So what I'll do in the second part of the lecture is talk about other regions, particularly these 3 here, and the particular role that they have in motivation. So actually going out there and looking at behavior. So motivation, what do we mean by that? So this is one kind of historical idea, so the hierarchy of needs, where at the bottom you've got your kind of Freudian id kind of needs for sex and food and water and so on, these kind of basic rewards. And then here you've got your kind of more social, perhaps culturally constructed things, morality, creativity, and so on. So these are all things that we would feel happy to say are kind of motivators, or I think pretty much all of them, but there's no real evidence necessarily that they exist in a hierarchy. Perhaps we might want to say that some are kind of evolved more in other species than others, in the same way as we've got this kind of culture pyramid. That might be one claim we would want to go with. But basically, it sums up the basic idea that there is, a very complex thing from, the way that we treat each other at one level to, I say it at the bottom. So, again here, what about the orbitofrontal cortex? So the orbitofrontal cortex is the bottom of your frontal lobe. So your frontal lobe kind of has a lateral surface, a middle bit, and a bottom bit. And your orbitofrontal cortex seems to be particularly involved in rewards and emotions. So it's got strong connections to the amygdala and various other subcortical circuits. your lateral frontal lobe seems to be more involved in kind of the control of action, or kind of things like the Wisconsin card sorting test, problem solving, this sort of thing, whereas the orbitofrontal seems to be more involved in rewards. And one way of thinking about this is in terms of contextualizing current rewards. So, for instance, the amygdala might store the basic association between a fear and a sound, but the orbitofrontal cortex would say, is this kind of currently fearful? What is the wider context in which this sound is occurring? Your kind of ongoing cognitions. So one good way of thinking about this is in terms of this fun study involving chocolate. So chocolate is something that is generally seen as being a positive or kind of rewarding stimulus. But if you were to eat 10 chocolate bars, it might cease to be, your wanting of it, your motivation for it will decrease. But it doesn't necessarily mean that chocolate becomes an unpleasant stimulus. It just means in this context, I do not want any more, thank you. But it doesn't actually reverse the association and make it so. You've got a part of the brain that says chocolate is nice, and you've got a part of the brain that says chocolate is nice now or chocolate is not nice now. And the idea is that that is your orbitofrontal cortex. So here it is on the bottom surface of the brain, kind of going in a little bit. So Damasio talks a lot about the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, and that's kind of the inner bit of the orbitofrontal cortex. It's kind of an extended circuit with it, so above your eyes, the orbits. I didn't tell you the actual chocolate eating study, what they do. So this is basically what they do, is that they feed people chocolate, whilst their brains are being scanned, and they ask them, how much do you like it and how much more do you want? And basically what you find is that over time people want more, and then after a while they say, no, I don't want any more. And your orbitofrontal cortex tracks this change. So initially what you would have is that when something is pleasant, you activate particularly the middle part of your orbitofrontal cortex here, and then over time, as you stop wanting it, this activity switches off and you start to activate the outer part of it. You've almost got this change between the middle and the outer part, but the basic idea is that you are contextualizing this emotion in terms of something that is wanted or not wanted. Yeah. That you've got the study about eating chocolate, also things like subjective pleasantness of music. So there's something called the chills that you can have in certain kind of musical crescendos where you feel this on your body, and this is the sort of thing that you get here. So that's kind of what the orbitofrontal cortex has done. In terms of fMRI, if you lesion your frontal cortex, the classic symptom here is impulsivity. And it's kind of, so in animals, in humans, it would be kind of poor financial judgments, kind of love of taking part in the lottery, and the thrill of kind of filling in your scratch card and thinking you might win. Patients who have orbitofrontal cortex behave kind of quite recklessly in terms of their finances and in terms of their social relationships, that they struggle to kind of maintain those. Their friends will soon leave them in a way that doesn't necessarily happen with other kinds of brain injuries. So the impulsivity, the way that you can think about this is that often if you damage your orbitofrontal cortex, there's this whole thing called temporal discounting, and that's whether £10 is worth more now, or would you rather have £12 next week? Okay. Now, depending on those intervals, how people vary in how long they're willing to wait for those kind of rewards. And your orbitofrontal cortex seems to be very much concerned about the immediate rewards. That as soon as you damage your orbitofrontal cortex, it's the immediacy of the reward that you kind of want from it, and that kind of judgment gets very skewed. But you can see that in terms of your daily life. Do you spend money on a holiday, or do you put it in some kind of pension fund or investment and so on that's going to mature later? But that's the kind of part of the brain that deals with that. Yeah.
It's been looked at through disorders tools, because I know that ADHD sort of has that issue of sort of impulsivity, sort of slash hyperactivity. Is that sort of similar and that's often associated?
Yeah, so this is obviously kind of, it's linked to kind of addiction and so on. So impulsivity is often kind of the trait that people have who become more addicted rather than people who take drugs. So taking drugs isn't linked to impulsivity. Keeping taking them is, as I understand it. Yeah, it is linked to a lot of kind of other disturbances as well. So there's a whole story about Tourette's as well with the orbitofrontal cortex, OCD, and things. That you've got these kind of rewards that are out of context, in effect, that are in many senses irrational, would be the right way of thinking about it, yeah. And the other kinds of things that you would have here is kind of risk-taking behaviour. So this is the classic kind of Damasio study where you've got risky kind of gambling. So he's got this gambling task. If you lesion your orbitofrontal cortex, the kind of ventromedial one, you carry on taking the risks, but you also don't show a skin conductance response. You do show a skin conductance response if you get a shock. So it's not that your body can't respond. It's just that your body doesn't respond to risk in that context. Okay, and there's a whole story about how the OFC differs from the amygdala in terms of how this works for that kind of decision making. The anterior cingulate cortex is this kind of long region here that's involved in various aspects of kind of emotional and non-emotional behaviour. So the classic non-emotional example is the Stroop effect. Where you've got to say the colour, where you've got some conflict here between this, so saying that is red, green, yellow, blue, yellow, white, and so on. That when you're performing that, your anterior cingulate is kind of looking for this. It's it could kind of be related again to the social, and it's more about kind of monitoring for errors or kind of conflicts more generally. This is kind of one claim, is that this is kind of involved in other kinds of affect as well. So although this is seen as cognitive rather than affective, it's certainly not social, I agree, but there is kind of an affective dimension. There is another part of the anterior cingulate, more at the front here, that you kind of see there. And this is, interestingly, a VBM study where you're looking at the amount of grey matter in people's brains in this. So these aren't people with brain damage. It's just taking a sample of, say, 100 people and giving them a structural MRI scan. And what you find is that basically people who say that they're kind of low status have reduced grey matter in this region. People who are high status have more. This particular study entered kind of more objective measures of status, such as income, in there as a covariate. So it was specifically around psychological status or psychological well-being. And they obviously the two are correlated, but they tried to covary out other factors. So one possibility, again here, particularly this region involved in the Stroop, what it's involved with is involved in computing the value of actions, where the orbitofrontal cortex is involved in computing the value of stimuli. So an action would be a response. So a response is, am I going to make an error, for instance, but it could be other things as well. And again, if you kind of contrast the different lesions in these two regions, so again, this is in rats rather than humans, but if you've damaged your orbitofrontal cortex, you become impulsive. You want your rewards now. Basically, if you lesion your anterior cortex, anterior cingulate cortex, you become lazy, in inverted commas, which means that you don't want to work for a reward. So it's not about the immediacy of the reward. It's about, I'm wanting to get a reward with the minimum effort, and I'm not willing to work anymore for a higher reward. That's the kind of behaviour. So you've got, both of them are kind of disrupting this kind of motivational or kind of evaluation, but in somewhat different ways. That seems to be the case. And here it's quite nice because you've got the same task in which you're manipulating different variables. So in one case, the rat has to jump over a small wall or a high wall. In another case, the rat has to wait. So one is about an inability to wait, and the other is not wanting to jump over a high wall. They'll just go over the little wall to get the reward. So the ventral striatum is projects to the orbitofrontal cortex, and it's kind of part of this loop around the basal ganglia. So the basal ganglia includes this region called the ventral striatum. In it, you've got this subregion called the nucleus accumbens, which is very important in the reward literature. So people here who are studying addiction and so on, it's all about the nucleus accumbens and this circuitry. So you've got rich dopaminergic inputs coming from the midbrain here into the ventral striatum, projecting into the orbitofrontal cortex. So it's often seen as kind of being an earlier signal up to the orbitofrontal cortex, as is the amygdala, is kind of an earlier signal into the orbitofrontal cortex. So the classic kind of studies on the ventral striatum, or one of them would be the kind of identified it as a reward center, is self-stimulation studies. So here, it's very simple. What they do is that basically you put a stimulating electrode into the rat or the mouse's brain, and you give it a lever, and when it presses the lever, it switches on its own brain. Okay? There's most regions of the brain, if you do this, the animal won't press the lever. They're quite neutral about it. There are some parts of the brain where the rat goes like this, and then it goes like that, and it will kind of, maybe give up eating and other things. So again, this is why it's been linked to addiction and other things. That whatever is going on, the rat seems to like it, it's willing to work for it, and in that sense, it's motivating in the way that I've described it. So you get that in the ventral striatum. You don't get it necessarily in other parts of the brain. You don't get it in the amygdala, for instance. An animal won't self-stimulate its amygdala with a lever. This is a great line of research by Dina et al. There's a number of other studies. It's kind of billed as monkey paper view. And what it is that you can effectively look at kind of subjective value in animals. So you might say, for instance, have something like 5 milliliters of juice, that the animal can either choose to have that or it can choose to have some other stimulus. And then you can vary it and say, well, so the other stimulus might be something like another monkey's face that it can choose. So it might be that the animal is willing to take 4 milliliters of juice to see the monkey's face, or 5 milliliters of juice and not see the face, whatever. So you can look how much are they willing to reduce the amount of juice they get in order to see the other stimulus. So that's why it's called monkey paper view. And monkeys like to pay to view high-status other monkeys. Male monkeys like to look at female monkeys' perineia, which is slightly bizarre. So, but you can look at how much they're willing to pay in order to see a stimulus of monkey porn, in effect. And but the interesting thing here is that these are neurons in the nucleus accumbens that are effectively adjudicating whether between these stimuli.
Has this study ever been replicated?
Yes, lots of times, but I don't know whether it's by different labs. But yes, so these are behavioural studies, and then the question is what part of the brain is making that decision? And it seems to be the nucleus accumbens that responds to this kind of trade-off between, in effect, social reward, seeing another animal, or, yeah, that's basically what they're doing with this. So the interesting thing there is that it is the same region of the brain that is coding both the social value and here the value of the food, although it's not necessarily the same neurons. So within this region, you've got some neurons that seem to code for the social value and some that seem to code for the non-social value. So you wouldn't see it from a lesion study, but you can see it through single-cell recordings. And these seem to project forward to the orbitofrontal cortex that's involved in that kind of decision. How much are you willing to value seeing that monkey's face or whatever for how many seconds? So they don't pay to view anything. So some neutral stimuli they're not going to pay for. Or a low-status monkey, they're not interested in them. Okay. So what exactly is the ventral striatum coding? Well, it seems to have a kind of dopaminergic response here. So, for instance, you've got dopamine release when you present food, but also reinforces the being paired with food. So, for instance, a light that's being paired with food, you would get it when you present the light, okay? Sex, these kind of basic Freudian kind of, bottom of the motivation hierarchy response to that, as well as stuff from actually high-level motivation hierarchy as well, if you want to think about it like that. In humans as well, when you're playing kind of economic games, it responds to the amount of monetary rewards. So this is the kind of equivalent of the monkey pay-per-view. Is if you're going to win £10 versus £5, you will get more activity in your nucleus accumbens for £10 relative to 5. So it kind of scales according to money and things like this, which again suggests, at least at the anatomical level, that you've got the same system used for what is in effect a cultural invention, money, as it is for something like sex and drugs and whatever, that are more biological. One of the curious things is whether it's actually signalling reward or the expectation of reward, and most people now seem to argue it's the latter. So here what you've got is kind of a classic conditioning study looking at single neuronal responses. So here this is just a histogram of when a neuron in the nucleus accumbens is responding. And here these are what are called raster plots. So each of these green things means that the neuron it produces an action potential. So here this is before you've got any kind of conditioning. And what you find here is that when you present the reward, which I assume to be food or drink to the mouse, that you've got a reward here. So you can see this kind of set of action potential. This is just the histogram here. Now what happens is that you present a light or a sound or something with the reward. So now what you've got is a contingent reaction that the light, say, predicts the reward. Now what you find is that when you present the light, the nucleus accumbens, the neurons in the nucleus accumbens respond to the light, but they do not respond to the reward. Okay? So it is not, in a way, it's not the reward that is triggering the firing of the neurons, it is the expectation of the reward. Or another way of thinking about it is that the reward is transferred away from the food onto the light or the actual cognition or expectation or belief in the reward itself. That itself becomes rewarding. And again, that has interesting implications socially in terms of beliefs and so on. So your nucleus accumbens fires when you pray if you're religious, but not if you're not religious, okay? So it's almost kind of expectations of rewards or can be rewarding in themselves. Yeah. This is what happens if you present the conditioned stimulus, but then you don't get a reward. Can you see what's happened here? You've got a little gap that it's actually gone below spontaneous activity here, that it's almost kind of expecting reward. So there is a difference between this one and this one here. So it's not that the reward is completely irrelevant. So here, normally after a second after the light goes off, it gets a reward, and it's like, where is it? What's going on? so here you've got that. And again, you can show this. This is at the level of single neurons. In humans, you can do similar studies with monetary rewards. So, for instance, if somebody's expecting £2, because that's kind of the rules of the game, and they're given £2, you don't get much of a signal change. But if you give them £5, you've got something that's better than expected. Then you get a big kind of signal change. But if you give them 50p or something, you don't. So if you're expecting £2 and you get £2, that isn't necessarily rewarding. It can be. Again, it depends on the context. But it is doing something quite clever here. It's not just coding reward. It is contextualizing at some level, even though this is a very basic circuit. It's something that's conserved from mice upwards. Yeah, and so another social example here, which I'll give another one in humans, would be... I'll save it for another lecture. Let's get on with it. So how do you kind of regulate these sorts of emotion circuitry? So again, the idea is or kind of the classic Victorian idea might be between the rational brain and the emotional brain. But of course, our real life interactions, the two are ongoing. We don't consciously switch between them. But nevertheless, there will be cases in which going for the, taking the money, buying the lottery ticket is disadvantageous, but you might know it's disadvantageous. So how do your kind of goals, your cognitive beliefs, and your kind of desire for rewards work together? And they have to work together, otherwise we'd just be working very impulsively and we wouldn't be able to set aside, having fun all the time or whatever. Maybe that's where the rest of the class are. But anyway, so one idea is kind of this very simple seesaw idea between balancing, in effect, what your long-term goals are and your kind of deliberate reappraisal of strategies. So the other part of your frontal lobes is your lateral frontal lobes, okay, which is seen as the more kind of rational side. It has more sensory, verbal inputs, and so it's involved in working memory and these kinds of things. And the idea is that this effectively interacts with sends signals to the orbitofrontal cortex, but also to your nucleus accumbens and amygdala, that in effect you've got these two. So you've got what here is described as a seesaw between emotional salience and your long-term goals. And in effect, the question is whether or not you act according to your long-term goals or the emotional salience is a balancing act between them. But it can be tipped. So if the emotion salience is particularly strong, so for instance, so here, so a strong Q exposure, or you're used to kind of taking drugs or whatever, that there is a strong kind of bottom-up impulse here, that basically this will win. But also you can down-regulate your frontal lobes if it's got damage, either because of brain damage or you've had too much drink that it's not functioning well, then again your emotional salience kind of captures it. So you've got this kind of idea of a seesaw between your ability to regulate, up or down regulate your emotions. Maybe this comes back to the idea of depression, that you've got reduced emotions, but this high kind of cognitive vigilance, basically, to whether people like you and this sort of thing. So there's some classic studies again from Kevin Oxner on this. Looking at this, so the kinds of things he's had, or what he reports in the literature, are things like images of people in traction. No idea whether that's the kind of image he uses. It's just what I got when I Googled it. And participants are just asked to do a number of things. One is just that they look at these images, so it's not really clear what they're doing in that case. When they're looking at these images, basically you have the emotional brain, or regions such as the amygdala and the orbitofrontal cortex is high, in effect. When they're given instructions to positively reappraise that, so what they mean by this is make the image appear better or more favourable than it really is. Actually, it was for his good, it's all for the best, he's not in any pain at all. Going through these kind of cognitions, what you then have is that the lateral prefrontal cortex goes up and your orbital frontal cortex and your amygdala go down. Okay? So it is this kind of seesaw that when you reappraise positively, you're almost dampening down your emotional circuitry and your lateral prefrontal cortex goes up. The other study, of course, is if you negatively reappraise it, it's like, oh my God, this is terrible, he's never going to walk again, this sort of thing, so catastrophizing. What happens here is that when you're reappraising, your lateral prefrontal cortex goes up, but your kind of orbitofrontal and your amygdala stays high. So in one case, reappraising dampens your emotional reaction. In the other case, reappraising keeps it high. So your prefrontal cortex seems to be involved in reappraising, but whether or not that switches off or maintains depends on what the nature of the high-level cognitions are around this. Okay? So again, we can think about how this can work in the social realm, really. But again, it comes back to some classic ideas that actually emotion is all in our limbic cortex, or kind of very primitive parts of the brain. and really we have to think about them in terms of circuits in which actually some of the most advanced parts of the brain participate, including, higher regions in our frontal lobes. Any questions about emotion regulation? Okay. It's one of those Sussex topics as well. So Eleanor Miles, for instance, it's one of the things she studies, and quite a lot of people study it here. It's one of those topics that's kind of come back into vogue, both in social psychology and actually more from the neuroscience end of it. Okay, so what I've kind of done under the guise of emotion is really give you a bit of a guided tour of various regions of the brain that are involved in signalling and learning about emotions, and also in guiding behaviour, both socially and non-socially. So that's another kind of key message, is that these kind of circuits, they work in multiple contexts. So they're adapted to work in the social domain as well as in the non-social domain.